In American history, the Gullah Wars stand as a pivotal series of conflicts that unfolded from 1739 to 1858. This epic, spanning over a century, was not just a period of warfare, but a complex tapestry of cultural, social, and political upheaval. It was a time when the deep-rooted tensions between indigenous tribes, European settlers, and African slaves in the American Southeast reached a boiling point. The Gullah Wars, often overshadowed in mainstream history, were instrumental in shaping the trajectory of the United States. They were not isolated incidents, but a continuum of resistance and survival, intertwined with the broader narratives of colonial expansion, slavery, and the eventual onset of the Civil War. The Guale War, a significant precursor to the broader Gullah Wars, was ignited by a profound shift in colonial power and the exploitation of indigenous people. This period marked the expulsion of the Spanish from the coastal regions of what is now Georgia and South Carolina, a territory traditionally inhabited by the Guale people. The departure of the Spanish, who had established missions and settlements in the area since the late 16th century, created a power vacuum swiftly filled by the British. British involvement in the region was driven by a desire for expansion and control over the lucrative resources of the New World. Unlike the Spanish, who had a complex relationship with the indigenous populations, often intermingling and converting them to Christianity, the British approach was more commercially driven. They viewed the rich lands, particularly the fertile soil ideal for agriculture, as opportunities for economic growth. Central to this economic plan was the forced labor of the Guale Indians. The Guale people, skilled in the cultivation of the land, found themselves victims of the burgeoning Atlantic slave trade. British and other European settlers began to systematically kidnap Guale Indians, exploiting their agricultural expertise for economic gain. This practice was not just a matter of labor, but a calculated strategy to exert control and dominance over the region. The kidnapping of the Guale Indians for labor set a precedent for the treatment of indigenous populations by European colonizers in the region. It was a blatant act of aggression that disregarded the autonomy and rights of the native people, leading to increased tensions and resistance. This period laid the groundwork for the subsequent conflicts and upheavals that would define the Gullah Wars, highlighting the complex interplay of power, resistance, and survival that characterized this era. Following the expulsion of the Spanish and the establishment of British control, the region witnessed a significant shift in its socio-economic landscape. The Guale Indians, indigenous to the coastal areas, were forcibly transported to the rice fields of South Carolina. Here, they were made to toil alongside African slaves in cultivating rice, particularly the highly prized Carolina gold. This strain of rice, known for its quality and value, became a symbol of wealth and prosperity in the colonies, but at the cost of immense human suffering. The African slaves, brought across the Atlantic in harrowing conditions, brought with them knowledge of rice cultivation from their homelands. This expertise, combined with the labor of the Guale Indians, was exploited to develop extensive rice plantations. The fusion of African agricultural techniques with the indigenous knowledge of the land created a robust rice-growing industry. However, this economic success was built on the brutal foundation of slavery and oppression. As the demand for labor grew, so did the intensity of kidnappings and raids. European colonizers and their allies often launched surprise attacks on Guale villages. These raids were characterized by their suddenness and brutality, involving village burnings, massacres, and the capture of men, women, and children. The use of weapons and force in these raids was a deliberate tactic to instill fear, exert control, and obtain labor for the plantations. The raids became increasingly sophisticated and ruthless, with the colonizers employing various strategies to overpower the indigenous populations. The indigenous communities were left decimated and traumatized, with their social structures and ways of life disrupted. Many Guale Indians, along with African slaves, found themselves entangled in a relentless cycle of violence and forced labor. Goose Creek, a significant location in the Gullah Wars, served as both a strategic starting point for many conflicts and a crossroads of cultures. This area, now part of modern-day South Carolina, was pivotal due to its geographical location and its role as a hub for interaction among various groups, including local Indian tribes, European settlers, and African slaves. Goose Creek symbolized the melting pot of tensions, alliances, and cultural exchanges that defined this era. The significance of Goose Creek lay in its strategic value to European settlers, particularly as a site for launching expeditions and raids. It also became a point of contact and, at times, conflict with local Indian tribes. These tribes, already grappling with the implications of European colonization, found themselves further entangled in the emerging power struggles and trade dynamics brought about by the settlers. The interactions at Goose Creek were complex, involving trade, negotiation, and, at times, hostility, reflecting the broader power dynamics at play during the Gullah Wars. Simultaneously, the role of African slaves in this region was multifaceted and critical. The treatment of African slaves presented a contrasting narrative. On one hand, there were instances where they were treated marginally better than in other colonies, primarily due to their expertise in rice cultivation. The knowledge they brought from Africa was invaluable in establishing and sustaining the Carolina gold rice plantations. This expertise granted them a certain level of importance, albeit within the confines of enslavement. On the other hand, African slaves were often caught in the brutal cycle of violence and exploitation that characterized the era. Their role extended beyond agricultural labor. They were also involved in the kidnapping of Indian tribes. This involvement was a direct result of the settlers' strategies to use slaves in expanding their control and influence in the region. Goose Creek thus represented a focal point where different narratives and histories converged. The interaction among European settlers, local Indian tribes, and African slaves in this area laid bare the complexities of the Gullah Wars. It was a place where cultures collided, alliances were formed and broken, and where the harsh realities of colonization, slavery, and resistance became starkly evident. The Gullah Wars, a complex tapestry of localized conflicts and cultural upheavals, seamlessly wove into the larger narrative of American history, culminating in the Civil War. This period was marked by a series of events and actions, particularly involving the Choctaw and Cherokee tribes, which highlighted the interconnectedness of these conflicts with the broader national struggle. The Choctaw and Cherokee tribes, significant players in this era, found themselves navigating a labyrinth of alliances and hostilities. Their involvement in the Gullah Wars, particularly in terms of their actions against other tribes and their interactions with European settlers, reflected the broader tensions that were simmering across the nation. These actions included participating in the kidnapping and trading of individuals from various tribes, a practice that not only fueled the Gullah Wars, but also mirrored the larger issues of slavery and territorial disputes that were central to the Civil War. The plight of the kidnapped victims from these tribes was a poignant chapter in this story. Men, women, and children, torn from their homes and communities, faced unimaginable horrors. Their abductions were not just acts of violence, they were assaults on the cultural and social fabric of the tribes. The response of their families and communities often involved desperate attempts at rescue and retaliation, leading to a cycle of conflict and violence that further stoked the fires of the Gullah Wars. As the Gullah Wars progressed, the lines between these localized conflicts and the national discourse on slavery and state rights began to blur. The issues of freedom, rights, and identity that were at the heart of the Gullah Wars echoed the sentiments that fueled the Civil War. The culmination of the Gullah Wars thus transitioned into the broader Civil War, marking a significant turning point in American history. The impact of the Gullah Wars extended far beyond their immediate time frame and location. These wars were a microcosm of the larger struggles that the nation was grappling with, struggles over autonomy, identity, and freedom. The Gullah Wars, stretching from 1739 to 1858, were more than a series of conflicts. They were a crucible of cultural and political change in American history. These wars, intertwining the fates of indigenous tribes, African slaves, and European settlers, encapsulated the complexities of power, resistance, and identity. As we reflect on this tumultuous period, we recognize its profound impact on the shaping of the United States. The legacy of the Gullah Wars offers enduring lessons on resilience and the inexorable pursuit of freedom. reminding us of the intricate tapestry of our nation's history.